All right, hey everybody, welcome back. It's Luke here, and today I'm going to talk about a little bit, maybe a touchy subject, but it's something I think really needs to be addressed. I think it's something that comes up quite a bit along with training, and just discuss it because I think if you can get a handle on this, which I think affects more people than we'd like to admit, I think a lot of good things can happen with your training. So, as I write this, it's already mid-July, but it's already mid-July, but we're in the build up for the fall marathon season. If you're running an early October race, we're at this point we're probably closer to 8 weeks in. More advanced runners are cranking into the workouts, while beginners really just kind of starting with the speed and stuff that you're at. It's far too early to be complaining about the dreaded cumulative fatigue, right? So what I mean by that is if you're like 8 weeks in, 9 weeks in, and you still have 8 to 10 weeks left, you should not be in cumulative fatigue yet. That's way too soon. You should not be in cumulative fatigue yet. That's way too soon. And yet we see it all the time. Like people are just dragging butt, right? Like they're struggling. And it's probably like in the summer, it's probably a combination of things that we talk about all the time. It's weather, training too hard. And this is what makes this conversation a little bit more tough because a lot of times it's hard to discern what is actually going on. But in any case, it's a tough spot to be in when there's that long left to go. And honestly, in the Facebook group, somebody said, "Well, I'm pushing the paces and I feel." Somebody said, "Well, I'm pushing the paces and I feel great." Blah blah blah. Oh, I'm tired. I'm tired because I'm running so much, but I'm pushing the paces. And I made the comment basically like, "Well, 10 weeks left is a long time. Like in this training plan, 10 weeks to go. The last 10 weeks is an eternity." That is, and there's no way you can compare that last 10 weeks to the first 8 weeks, especially if you are in the beginner plan, right? Because you're spending 4 weeks just running easy mileage, and then you're just gradually building into workouts. And then by the time you get to 10 weeks to go, you're doing strength workouts, you're doing big tempo runs, you're doing your biggest long runs, your mileage is at the highest. You're doing your biggest long runs, your mileage is at the highest, and you got to do that for 2.5 months, right? So there is no comparison. It's like saying the halfway of the marathon is really 13 miles. It's not true at all. It's much further, much further. But in any case, it's a long way to be in a position where things aren't going to get, like if you're tired now and you still have 2.5 months to go, realistically to say that's not going to get better if you just continue on the same path that you are, right? And that's the point I'm trying to make here. But like I said, like anything in life, it's usually not just one thing that's causing the issue, but a combination of things. But I do think another thing, being fixed at the same time leads to multiple things being fixed at the same time, and you can see improvements. And so when you look at this situation where people are being too fatigued way too soon into the program, like we said before, it's training too hard, not adjusting for the heat, and then the third one is doing way more than they think that they are. And over the years, I've addressed training too hard, not adjusting for heat. I'm not going to do that again. I want to focus mostly on the underperforming, and I'll reference some of those blogs below. But for now, I just really want to focus on the underfueling and the consequences of not fueling for the work. And the reason why I say that it's more prevalent than I think people think it is just based on when somebody signs up for coaching with us, we offer them a free, basically nutrition consult. Like I'm a nutritionalist. Nikki, my wife, is a nutritionalist, and so what they'll do is they can get a free consult, usually with her, and we look at what they're eating versus what their training looks like, right? And you might not be surprised, but like how many people are grossly under eating and thinking that they actually need to cut more calories, right? Or think that they need to stop eating carbohydrates or stop whatever the case is, right? But a lot of times it's like, they think that they can train for a marathon, run 60 miles a week and do it on 1,800 calories a day. And that's not, I'll be honest with you, this is not going to happen, right? And so, and then you see it all the time, like performance is plateaued, they're always injured, they're sick all the time, whatever the case is, right? Sometimes all of those things. And so that just leads me to think that they're grossly underfueling. And the thing that makes it tough is the symptoms of underfueling versus overtraining often look a lot alike, right? So some of them, I mean, all the research I did, there was a lot. I mean, you could find like 20 different symptoms, right? But I'll just focus on what I see as a coach the most often, right? So the first one is the lack of energy, right? This is definitely, to me, the most common. It's also most likely to get confused with overtraining, right? You're training hard, it's hot out, you just think that those are the culprits, right? And a lot of times too is you don't feel like eating with that, right? You don't feel like with that, right? You don't feel like, which is actually the second one, so I'm getting ahead of myself. But if you're dragging and you're only a few weeks into the training, or even 2 months, where especially with the beginner plan, right? If you're 2 months in and all you've done is kind of built your volume up and you just started workouts and you're already complaining that it's too hard, this is probably the first thing I would look at, is if you're eating enough, right? And making sure that you're fueling properly. And but to me, it's a good chance that underfueling is definitely playing a part, right? The other things can play a part too, but I think this would be the major culprit. The second thing I kind of led into, insatiable hunger or no appetite at all. Many times you'll see people who are training for a marathon for the first time and they're eating everything in sight. And at that point, at any point of the day, right? And to me, those are usually newer runners, and they've never been in this position before, and so they've never been in a spot where maybe they were underfueling, or maybe they were actually fairly close to keeping that balance when they were just running 20 miles a week for their 5K or whatever, the grossly underfueling, right? And so now their body's reacting by eating everything in sight, and so they might actually put a little bit of weight on. Whatever the case is, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's actually probably good that if they're actually feeding that hunger, then it's probably good. The second thing you'll see is actually no appetite, and we talked about that a little bit, right? So more I think when people are more chronically underfueled, say for months or years even, then they just kind of lose that appetite. I feel like they kind of get that, I saw a term for it the other day, like the starvation adaptation. And so from my understanding is basically like, but if you need 2,000 calories and you just eat 1,500 calories a day, no matter what, the starvation effect kind of kicks in and it just kind of slows your metabolism down so that you can actually match that. But the problem with that is then ultimately your performance is going to be hindered, and then it's going to be very hard to either gain or lose weight because your metabolism is all jacked up. All right, but a lot of times you'll see they are probably more likely to suppress that feeling of hunger, or just not have that feeling of hunger because they're just so used to it that their brain has just adapted to that. Injuries that are slow to heal, right? So I'll see it a lot of times where people are chronically getting injured, or they'll come in and they'll be like, I missed my last marathon, I was injured, and then you kind of dig into their history, and it's always something that breaks up the consistency. It's always something that breaks up the consistency. It's always something that not severe, but it's just always something that their body breaks down, and they have to either adjust their plan, they have to take 2 weeks off at the most poor time to be able to do it, whatever the case is, right? So, or if they get that injury, it's something that maybe should take, whatever the case is, right? So, or if they get that injury, it's something that maybe should take like a week to heal, maybe it takes a month to heal, right? Something like that. So a lot of times that is due to not fueling enough, not giving your body the nutrients it needs in order to actually heal itself. Same thing with frequent illness, like you can suppress the immune system, colds and flu and whatever the case is, right? So, but whether it's injury or illness or both, they can't stay healthy, and the person can't stay healthy. Like you see it all the time, like as soon as we ramp up somebody's training, they're hurt again. Or they were doing well with training for lower volume, and then they just jump up the training, lower volume, and then they just jump up the training again and they get hurt again, right? And it's like, it doesn't even matter how slow you take it or how you spread it out. Regardless of how you attempt it, they seem to get hurt. I would say it would be a factor in overtraining, but it's also, if you're not fueling yourself with enough, eventually you're going to lose that ability to perform, or you just have that loss in performance too because you are always coming back from an injury or illness or something like that. But a lot of people will assume that a lot of people will assume that they are in cumulative fatigue when they get to this point, but you got to remember the main point with cumulative fatigue is that yes, you're tired, but your performance doesn't change, right? You're still able to hit your workouts. Your easy runs are probably a little bit slower, but overall, your workouts are fine. You know, you might be sore and stiff the first mile or so into a 10 when you hit the pace and you find out, and then you get done and you're like, okay, that wasn't as bad as I thought, but then the next day you're tired and sore again, right? But overall, that performance stays the same. But the bottom line is feeling like crap and then getting slower is not cumulative fatigue. That's something that's either overtraining or underfueling. That's either overtraining or underfueling for the most part. And the truth is, underfueling is probably the source of the overtraining, right? And I would argue that it's overtraining brought on by not being fueled enough, right? So why is it so important to this obvious thing? But while for the short term, like a few days, you know, like if you're in caloric deficit, you know, the day of a race, maybe not a marathon, but you know, like a 10K or 5K or something like that, kind of can actually kind of help you, right? It can actually help you run a little bit faster, but you don't want to be that way in training for very long. You know, and unfortunately, you see this with women's running, where they'll even, you know, maybe even have a season of lower caloric. Women's running, where they'll even, you know, maybe even have a season of lower caloric intake, or you know, maybe at least back in the day. Like I do think I will say this. I think that culture has changed a tremendous amount, right? So, I mean, when I was at Central Michigan, it was weird. It was, you know, there was definitely, you know, kind of that fit don't fly mentality a little bit, maybe even with the guys team a little bit. But then actually one of the women athletes had a very serious problem. And actually passed away. And after that, things changed drastically. And, you know, and it's so sad that it took that to change the culture, but it did. And I think overall, in terms of everywhere in the U.S. and the collegiate system, and even further beyond that, I think you're seeing the importance that's not starving yourself, and it's not even necessarily losing weight. It's more about just changing body composition, right? So if you're at 20% body fat and you want to get to 15% body fat, we don't need to lose 10 pounds we don't need to starve ourselves and lose muscle too. We just need to figure out how sometimes the weight won't change, but the body composition does. And that's really kind of what we're looking for. So I got off track a little bit there, but you'd see it, we see it, and actually Coach Al and I were talking about this with Michigan State and how, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the girls team won NCAAs, and you know, you look back at that pictures from that, and those girls were very, very thin, and then they ran great, which it sucks because it propels them to do it more, right? And so that's the thing, like short term, you may see a lot of success, but on the other hand, none of those girls even really made it to the track season because they were all, and unfortunately, you look now, and their bodies will probably never be what they would have been if they hadn't done that to their metabolism, things like that, right? So it's a very dangerous road to go down. And it's something like if you don't have complete control and you don't view food as a certain way, then it's going to wreak havoc, right? And it's not something I would even mess with, right? You know, it's like I use my brother-in-law is a bodybuilder, and you know, he views food strictly as fuel the vast majority of the time, right? He can turn it on and turn it off as he needs to, depending on where he's at for a competition, right? So if he's like, actually today he's competing for in a professional bodybuilding show, and it's like the last 2 weeks, he's a complete a-hole because he doesn't eat any carbs for 2 or 3 weeks, whatever the case. I don't really follow the world, but then in any case, like as soon as he's done with that show, he's eating everything he can. Like he can change his body. Like when he's, depending on where he's at in a show, and it takes him 6 months or something like that to train full cycle for a show, he will literally go and just bulk up, get as big as he possibly can, and then by the time he gets to the show, he's probably 75 pounds lighter, but he's just super toned and obviously very, very muscular. But as soon as that's done, that switch in his brain turns off. As soon as that's done, that switch in his brain turns off, and he's eating normal again, right? So if you can't do that, and you kind of have those negative views on food, then you probably have a little bit more serious issues, right? And it's probably beyond the scope of this for discussion, and you probably would want to seek some help. It's not good, and the least of your worries is that performance will decrease, and you'll find yourself in a position where you plateau out, and you start seeing those things. You're getting injuries, getting the illnesses, and then what I see a lot of times too is like people will hit that plateau. They don't really look at the food part of it, but they just don't eat enough of it, and so they're in their mind that they think, well, I need to train harder, and a lot of times it's not. And a lot of times you'd probably be better if you just ate more and backed off a little bit and let your body adapt, and you see a lot of much better performances. But that's the point. What ends up usually happening is you chase poor performance with harder training instead of looking at, was I fueling properly? Was I eating enough during the day? All these things, right? And it's hard too, because a lot of times when you get into that position where you are chronically underfueled, but you're still kind of, my body doesn't look the way I want it to, and like, it's a crappy example, but you have to look at those, like you see those infomercials for those kids in Africa, right, with the big bellies. They're clearly starving to death, but so why do they have these big bellies, right? Like it's just this. Not enough food is not their not enough food is not their not enough food is their problem, not that they're eating too much, right? And that's how you kind of have to look at it too. So but main point here is that the poor performance usually fuels harder training, and it just sets the cycle for more, and so it's a vicious cycle to go down. So how it happens, I have a few ideas here. Unintentional undereating. That's when a person signs. It's like when a person, like I said, when a person signs up for coaching, we offer the nutrition guides. I already went over that, but I feel like more times than not, a person has no idea what amount of food they should actually be eating. And sometimes it's not even about adding more stuff to their diet. It's more about just fueling for their workouts and long runs. Like they're, doing a pre-tempo run, and maybe like a gel or, a shake or something like that, actually fueling during the workout and then if they just did that, a lot of times their problems would go away. So that's the first thing that I would look at. And a lot of times if you can just do that, it bumps them up much more into a sustainable range. You're not into that big deficit. Second thing is you're not recognizing not actually recognizing your actual caloric needs. So on the flip side, so some people are very receptive to that. Other people are not very receptive to that. And they're like, no, I only need 1,800 calories. This is what so-and-so told me. And that might be fine if you're going to Orange Theory. Not fine if you're running 40, 50, 60 miles a week and training for a marathon. You're going to need more calories, right? And most people, we see a lot of people eating less than 2,000 calories a day who don't think that they need more calories to sustain what they're trying to do for training, right? And that's a very tough spot to be in. And Russ, honestly, like if somebody's not willing to recognize that, that's a big red flag for coaching for us. Like, how coachable are these people actually going to be? But that's another story. But if you find yourself in that position, I would take a hard look at like, okay, do the math on what you're actually burning for workouts and what you need to survive during the day. Are you taking anywhere near that? Third thing is trying to lose weight. I know it seems counterproductive, but training for a marathon is not always the best way to lose weight, right? Because you need the fuel to perform. So if we're scaling that back, then we're taking away from the fuel, and then ultimately what happens is we're losing stuff. We're losing stuff that we don't want to lose, right? We're losing muscle mass, we're losing bone density, things like that. The things that we want to keep, we end up losing, and we keep the fat because our body's like, hey, I need the fat to survive because we're in starvation mode, right? So that's a tough spot to be in. I think early on in the segment, if you're going to just take a 2 to 3, 4 weeks segment where you're just kind of more building base, and you kind of go into a slight deficit every day and burn, 3, 4, 5 pounds, that's one thing. But if you're trying to lose, 10, 15, 20 pounds, and your goal is to do it by training for a marathon, probably not the best option. The next thing I see is the fear of carbohydrate, which is unfortunate. And I always get pushback for this, but you have to have carbohydrate. Like you have to have carbohydrate, you have to have fat, you have to have protein, right? They're there for a reason. Your body needs them. And if you're going to do something, that burns a lot of carbohydrate, then you need to replace that carbohydrate, right? Going back to what I said for unintentional undereating, a lot of times it's more about adding more carbohydrate. It's not necessarily adding more carbohydrates to your diet. So if a person's like 50% carbohydrate in their general diet, their breakfast, their lunch, their dinner, their general snacks, that's probably fine, right? But if that same person is not fueling during their workouts, that's where the problem comes into. Like if you can fuel during the workouts with the carbohydrate and do it at the rates that you need, so at least bare minimum 30 grams an hour of carbohydrates, preferably at least bare minimum 30 grams an hour of carbohydrates, preferably 60 plus, you're going to get a lot of calories from carbohydrates. You can take 60 times, 4.5, and it's going to give you a significant, it's a few hundred calories right there that you're going to get extra. That's going to add to your overall percentage of carbohydrate per day, but it's not going to mess with your overall diet. It's not going to mess with what you're eating for dinner, what you're eating for lunch, that type of thing, right? So that's the important thing to keep in mind, right? You can boost your carbohydrate intake, but not necessarily have to change what you're eating in your general diet. A lot of times it's just what you're fueling with, or if you're not fueling at all, or if you're not during and after, right? So if you're doing the pre and during, you're getting those carbohydrates that you need, and then afterwards you're getting the the protein and the carb. A lot of times that caloric deficit will go away. So I think that you have to really, really look at what you're doing for that situation. What to do if you see performance is declining, all the things we just talked about. But at the core of the problem, obviously, you don't have enough calories left over after you exercise to fully support your physiological function, right? And so that's, organ function, your breathing, living, those things are going to... So when you take that out and you look into all those variables, we're looking at basically two separate things. We're looking at the amount of work you're doing and the amount of calories you're taking in. Those are the two things that we can adjust for. So the reality is we probably are going to have to adjust both of these areas for some time, right? And so the question becomes, should I track my calories? And so I personally, I loathe it, tracking calories. It's not super accurate. It's not something that is necessarily practical, and it can be very wide variation on what's actually in something that you eat, right? And so I don't like it. I don't think I ever have my athletes actually track their calories, except for when we do the actual consultation with them, right? Because we have to have something to look at. But so like I said, if you really want to see what's going on, I don't think it's a bad idea. Something like MyFitnessPal. I do have my athletes do that just to kind of, like, if we want to do a log check to see what they're eating. And a lot of times for me personally, it's not even really about the calories that I'm looking at. I'm just seeing what they're eating, right? Like, and we can point out the calories that I'm looking at. I'm just seeing what they're eating, right? Like, and we can point, a lot of times you can just point out what they're eating and if they're eating enough of it, right? So it's not even necessarily the caloric intake that I'm talking about. But so let's say you start tracking MyFitnessPal, whatever. I know there's a million out there. You can easily track but MyFitnessPal is nice because you can sync your stride with your food intake, right? And it'll actually show you like how many calories you have left over, how many calories you're in a deficit for, right? And if it's something like 100 calorie deficit, like that you could chalk that up to differences in accounting for carbohydrates, whatever. I'm not going to worry about that. But where I would be worried is if I see drastic differences, especially negative differences, 600-700 calories a day, and then there's never really a day where that's made up, right? And so that's something that I think if you see that red flag, then that's something we can address. And then once we got to make a decision, right? So if you, let's say you go do that, you do a 3-day log and you're seeing, man, I'm like 700 calories short every day. Okay. And I feel like crap. I feel like an injury is coming on. My performance sucks. What do I do? Right. So the truth is you're probably going to have to reduce your volume and your intensity that you're running, right? So I'm training and you're in this situation, but you have to weigh what the consequences of not doing it are, right? And so while I realize that's a blow to your soul immediately, I think the long-term positive changes that will come from this far outweighs what you might have to do for this training segment, right? I think that's how you have to look at it. And I'm not necessarily take all that time off. I'm saying you've got to give yourself some time to easy. If you can just run easy for 30 minutes, that's going to go a long way in maintaining fitness. I know it doesn't seem like it, but go back to some of our blogs on how fast you actually lose fitness when you're doing something versus when you're doing nothing, and then look at how fast it actually comes back compared to what the old adage is, and it's significantly different. So I know it might suck, but it's something I think if you're really serious about being the best performer you are, and not even that, just being generally healthy, living a good, healthy life, I think you really have to consider doing this, right? And if that's, stop listening or reading this anyway. Like I said, even if you were to take a week off, your fitness loss would be negligible. If you simply reduce the volume and ran easy for a week, you probably won't lose any fitness, and you'll actually probably start to feel a little bit better. And I personally think that is a win-win. And this is a win-win. And the second part of that is obviously the calories per day. This can be a struggle if you're the type of person who runs so that you can eat. And then when I tell you to back off running, at the very, don't cut the volume back too. If you're cutting the volume back on the running, don't cut the volume back, right? So we want to make that a net positive on the caloric intake, not keeping it a net negative. And so you'll see that like potentially with the reduction of calories being burned, your body can start to restore balance. So you can see that it's a two-pronged attack, right? We're going to have to at the very least, maintain caloric intake and reduce volume, and then see how that goes after a few days at the very least. But honestly, it's going to be more than that probably. So if you can find a way to take a reduction training, boost your caloric intake with something nutrition. Again, I don't think for most people, I don't think it's going to have to be crazy. I think it's more like just, can you add a few hundred calories? I mean, once in a while, we'll see somebody who we say, okay, we're looking at your training. You need 2,500 calories a day. You say you're eating 1,500 calories a day. Some of that I don't, or they underreport what they're eating. So a lot of times I think that caloric intake is actually probably higher than what's being reported. And that's another reason why I don't necessarily like caloric reporting or daily tracking or whatever. I think there's a lot of error involved there. But like I said, it shows you what you're eating. My point is, if you can add a little bit, even if it's just more fruit during the day, snack here and there. If you just ate your 3 squares a day, you didn't eat any snacks, try eating 2 snacks a day. Or try doing a nutrition shake with a high quality whey protein and some fruit before bed. That can actually help preserve muscle mass and actually boost metabolism, boost hormone production, which you would also metabolism, all those good things. So there's simple things that you can do that over time will yield very significant results. And that's the big thing. Small changes over time is usually the best bet. It might not be perfect. It doesn't even have to be perfect. It just has to be something. And all we're really doing is just looking to get better at it. Okay? So that's the thing I want you to take away from that. Ultimately, our goal is to be healthy. Our goal is to train consistently. And a side factor of that would be to actually perform better, right? Like if we can do all that and feel better and then actually run faster, that's always a good thing too. So how long will it take for this to happen. And that's going to depend, right? That's going to depend on how honest you are with yourself, how coachable you are, even if you're your own coach, how severe the problem is, how quickly you can adapt change, how long the deficiency has existed, right? If you're one of those people who are ramping up your miles and you just don't eat, you probably see changes pretty quick. But if you've chronically held back on calories for months and years, it's going to be a significant amount of time that this is going to have to be restored, right? So, but that's a lot of factors. Odds are it's not going to be a couple days, probably be a few weeks. Like, not saying you can't train, but it's going to have to definitely be reduced, and you're going to have to make sure that that balance is made and actually have probably a little bit more than what you are burning, right? So if you need, 2,200 calories a day, you probably need to make sure you're getting 2,400 calories a day, right? So something like that. For women, it can take 6 months or longer for regular menstruation to return. For men, it can be the same amount of time for bone density to return. So it can be quite a long time. And I think that the thing you have to consider is if is it worth to you keep digging a hole that it's not getting better, and is it worth the hundreds and thousands of dollars in race fees, gears, travel, just so that you can continue to be frustrated, continue to be injured, continue to be sick, wonder why you're doing this, all that, keep your overall health in jeopardy? Is that worth it? Or do we take the time now and fully invest in your health and performance? I would think that the latter would be better. The easiest thing, of course, is to avoid the situation, right? That's always, hindsight is always 20/20, right? If you're usually okay, but you don't seem to ramp up the nutrition with what your training needs when you go from a different situation, you're in a much better position to right the ship much sooner. Take the time to really look at what you need, determine if you're fueling yourself pre, during, post-workout, make any tweaks you need to. It might only be a couple weeks where you just kind of reduce everything, scale back your workouts, things like that. You might bounce back in a couple weeks. But for today, if you take an honest assessment with where you're at, but you're in denial of how serious the consequences can be, I urge you to, just as beyond the scope of this for sure. And I urge you to seek professional guidance. I know there's people out there and I know there's runners out there that deal strictly with, disordered eating and those types of things. But this is really meant for people who just aren't sure what's going on, right? They're not sure if they're overtraining or what, and they can't figure things out. This is who this was for. It wasn't meant to cure any disordered eating, and so you have to take that with a grain of salt. Secondly, overtraining is often the combination of training too fast for too hard, too many workouts too close together, and poor sleep habits, things like that. And then lastly, underfueling, right? So is overtraining a real thing, or is overtraining a byproduct of underdoing these other things, right? And I would argue underfueling, under-recovering, try to do too many workouts too soon, those are the real sources of the overtraining, and that the overtraining that you're feeling is just a symptom of all of those things. And the vast majority of people I work with, they can handle the work that's scheduled, right? They can do it. They know how to do it. They just struggle with getting the other facets. They can do it. They know how to do it. They just struggle with getting the other facets down. And if you can get those facets down, and you can take a good look at those things, are you truly getting what you need to support your training and fix what's not being met? Then I really think good things will happen with your running, right? Even a half of the way through an 18-week marathon cycle, and you're really dragging your behind, that should not be the case, and that shouldn't be cumulative fatigue. And you have to look at other factors, and then the other we've talked about it, with the other things, are you hitting paces? With the other things, are you hitting paces? All that other stuff we talked about earlier. But the big thing I think you have to look at is, are you underfueling for what you're trying to accomplish? And most people, I would say, are in some sort of position where they are a little bit, at least a little bit. So take a good bar, the easiest fix, right? And then you start being more consistent. You start feeling healthier. The training starts actually kicking in. You can probably, I feel like you can actually do more on less, which is good. And then performances will follow. And that's what we're all looking for, right? So, all right, hopefully later. All right, see you.